Okay, so I'll resume. So the next part is introduction to red teaming. So I'm going to explain what is red teaming and some concepts related to that and how this fits into the whole security picture. So I guess maybe I should have done this presentation at in the first hour and then swapped them around. But Secura, the company that I work for, was founded in 2000. We have a strong security expert team. We're very technical. We used to be called Medicine Gurkha, and that's where we come from. So that's our very strong technical background. And our mission is to help clients take control of their digital security by providing world-class independent advice, test and assessment services, and really fantastic PowerPoint presentations. So the idea of our company is that we want to be a trusted security partner, and we see the whole security landscape as being this house, which is our kind of the way we structure our thing. So the roof of the house is assurance and certification, and then to make sure that you have some kind of assurance process and that you can certify that assurance process, of course you need the pillars that support that, one of which is having a security organization and training, so understanding what processes you need to actually implement security. And then as well, actually doing the security testing, having continuous scanning, code review, and things like this. And we break these things up into various specific knowledge domains, so like SCADA, ICS, and whatever. Pen testing, code review on the right there, GDPR, ISO 27001, very auditor stuff on the left. And kind of in the middle is red teaming. So the idea of red teaming is that you're actually trying to simulate what would happen if some malicious guy off the street just tried to walk into an organization and see how far they can get. Right? And so the idea is that who is that malicious guy? He's some sort of threat actor, and the NCSC specifies the following threat actors. So professional criminals, state-level actors, right? Like you had the Russian spies flying over to the UK to do all kinds of stuff. Terrorists, hacktivists, cyber vandals, and script kiddies, private organizations, because of course there's competition, right? Like you saw between Uber and Waymo and stuff like that, people trying to steal secrets. Who knows if one of them sent a guy into the other organization to pretend to be a junior or something, join them for their onboarding event and try to siphon away all the secrets. And there's, of course, internal actors, which we see quite often as well, right? Where in sensitive companies, there'll be people who end up getting tried for treason and things like that because they're leaking sensitive information about nuclear power plants or solar panels or electric cars or whatever. And then, they're going to get in trouble for that. So they're internal people who have been motivated by various things to try and steal. So a brief background of red teaming. There's a good quote from Donald Rumsfeld. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. So indeed, red teaming is trying to learn the things that we don't know, trying to even know what things we don't know, not necessarily trying to understand them, but just to know what gaps do we have in our knowledge, what gaps exist in the whole security process that an organization has. So the idea is, of course, there's the threat, so there's known threats and unknown threats, and the observability, so do we know, have we seen it? So a historical event is both a known threat and it was observed. It happened, we know what happened, there was a threat and we've seen it. An unknown threat is big data. So we know that there's big data. We have data captured for absolutely everybody on all aspects of what they're doing online with Facebook, with Google, everything like that. And we don't know what this might lead to in the future, what kind of violations of privacy or other things, what other threats will exist about this. Airport security is a known unknown. So we know the threat, people smuggling bombs and guns, but we don't know who's doing it or which ones are doing it, and so we have to monitor everybody to pick that out. And then the unknown unknown is red teaming. That's what red teaming is for. It's trying to figure out what threats can affect our organization, and then what can we do to see those threats, catch them. And this affects multiple things. So, of course, the infrastructure, what kind of monitoring and logging do you have in place? It affects your procedures. How do people gain privileged access? Like, how are administrators approved? How is a manager approved? How do you approve the expense claims of your employees? Is it like 2 eyes, 4 eyes principle, whatever? Web applications, of course. Are they vulnerable or not? Are they exposed externally? Are they only internal? How do you access them? Who can access them? And what can they lead to? And that also relates to mobile applications. And finally, there's humans, because of course humans can be directly targeted. If you know somebody has the code to a safe, and you know that they're maybe broke because their family is sick or something and they need a bunch of money, then you can approach them with these kinds of incentives and target them. So red teaming covers all of these aspects. It tries to understand how every component of an organization can be attacked and then it tries to provide measures and improvements for that organization to actually address these threats in an ongoing manner, to not just be able to deal with them once they've happened, but to be able to catch them as they are occurring, potentially prevent them. So some examples of targets: acquiring intellectual property, right? If you steal Tesla's secrets on, well, I mean, they've published how the engines work and stuff like that, but maybe they have some other secrets, how they're handling their whole medical fiasco at the moment. Maybe leaking that out would be interesting to like a news organization, or maybe actual specific intellectual property. Acquiring restricted information, so something sensitive maybe by a government, documents that have been redacted, and then you're trying to retrieve what actually has been redacted from those documents. Gaining access or privilege to something. Maybe this is controlling like a nuclear station, right? Like with the attacks that were happening in Iran many years ago, Stuxnet and things like this, you know, targeting ICS SCADA of really specific industrial equipment to try and compromise that, to try and disrupt like nuclear development or whatever. Potentially, if you could gain access to a dam and you could open it up and flood a city, you know, that might be interesting to some people if they want to wage war or they're thirsty. Enforce reputation damage, right? So by causing problems, especially at a crucial moment, like a launch of a product publicly, you can really cause a lot of reputation damage, especially if it's a security-related company or a company that really requires security to be something you trust. Right now, Facebook is facing this quite a bit because there's a lot of questions about what they're doing, how they're handling sensitive information. And suddenly everybody's realizing that actually since 5-10 years now, they've had quite a specific goal of gaining as much information about people as they can. And only now are we seeing really the impacts of that, how that's affecting people. There was even a thing recently about do your devices listen to you even when they're not on, like Google, you know, like, okay, Google, and it does something because it's always listening. And there was an article that some lady was talking about something to a friend and then suddenly saw ads based off of what she was talking about in her browser, even though she'd never searched for that before. I'm not sure if this is actually the case. Maybe she did, maybe somebody else searched for her. But the point remains that there's a lot of reputation damage that can occur when you expect to have your users' trust, when you need to have your users' trust for your business to function, and then that trust is proven to be breached. So ultimately what happens in a red teaming engagement is that you have a red team and a blue team which are kind of competing. The blue team is generally how we call the SOC, the Security Operations Center, which would be the guys working for the organization, monitoring all of the connections, monitoring what's actually happening within the organization. Are there alerts from the firewall? Is there some kind of weird user login behavior where a user who was previously logged in Canada is suddenly logging in from China, right? That could be a flag that something's happening. And if your security team is actually monitoring this kind of stuff, then maybe they will pick up on an attack or on some kind of problem that's occurring before it can actually result in some kind of severe exploitation and damage. And then on the other side is the red team, which is the hackers who are actually trying to find out what can we exploit? What can we find in your organization, and what information does that lead to us? And in a red teaming attack or a red teaming exercise, there's also a white team above, which is typically like the CISO of the company who has actually signed off on all of the activities. Because part of the problem is, in order to test the blue team, in order to test how well they are at monitoring and detecting attacks, they can't know up front that they're going to be attacked. Otherwise, it's going to be quite trivial for them to just be like, well, everybody watch this because we know that this is going to attack. So as soon as it does, push the red button and we're done, right? So you need to make sure that it's quite hidden from everybody that this is happening. And also just to make sure that it's a valid test, like can I tailgate into an organization? If I pretend that I'm a maintenance guy with a clipboard, can I walk into your server room and just pick up one of the servers and walk out the door with it? And I've had colleagues who've done this and then taken photos from the parking lot of an organization with the entire trunk of a car open and 5 servers and a couple of monitors in there. And he's got some kind of uniform on with a clipboard and he looks like some kind of janitor or maintenance worker or something like this. And just based on looking the part and nobody really paying attention to this, because if you have a clipboard and you look like you know what you're doing, most people won't care in a big enough organization. Just based on that, he was able to steal a ton of really sensitive equipment. And then the proof was the photo. So a red team operation will typically follow specific steps. And then this order is it's kind of standard. It's a bit defined by OWASP. There's different names for it. But ultimately the point is, first, of course, you plan the entire engagement, which means you need sign off from the CISO, from the organization, saying, yes, you're allowed to do the following attacks, because some things might not be allowed, because of course some attacks might result in actual damage to the organization, maybe taking down the production servers, or if it's something like controlling water dams or nuclear stations, potentially you could cause like the next Chernobyl or something, and who knows. So you don't want to accidentally do that, and certainly no organization is going to approve that you're allowed to do this and potentially cause Armageddon. So that's the planning stage, and then you make sure everybody's aligned on what's actually going to occur. You have timelines, you have paths of escalation, things like this. Then you do your reconnaissance, followed up by exploitation. Once you've found a target that you can exploit, you exploit it. There's post-exploitation, at which point you're trying to either cover your tracks or do lateral movement. So once you've compromised one host, you're going to hop around to other hosts within the network to try and see what you can see there. And then you're going to exfiltrate whatever data you can, because obviously you're trying to steal something, unless you're just trying to do damage, which is also possible. But generally you will want to take some kind of information from the client and send it out. And then you want to cover your tracks and close everything off cleanly. So the planning stage is broken up into a few components. So there's the project planning itself, meaning, of course, decide what are the valid targets, what is the window of engagement, whether it's a week, a day, multiple months, ideally, so that the red team has actually a chance to really plan stuff and react to situations and events as they unfold. So maybe something comes out in the news and we can capitalize on that. Maybe the company is having a company barbecue, and then we can use emails to invite people to the barbecue, and if they fill in their credentials, then they can win like a barbecue set or maybe a whole chicken or something. And then a lot of people are going to be like, yeah, absolutely, I want a chicken, and they'll fill in their credentials, and then all of a sudden you have everybody's username and password externally, right? And so depending on what's allowed, that's what you put in the plan. The dynamic attack infrastructure, so basically you map out what infrastructure is there, and this was written in Dutch, I think, but you map out what infrastructure was there, and based on what actual hardware and software components are present, you attack them. You see what vulnerabilities exist and what you can do with those. And then there's the rules of engagement. So what actually are you allowed to do? In which situations do you need to escalate to the manager, to the CISO, to say, hey, look, we ran into a block. And likewise, they need their own processes to understand what to do if something happens. Because if you are on the red team and you're infiltrating an organization and you're doing something you're not supposed to do, and you're caught, then probably they're not going to react nicely. Usually you'll be escorted somewhere, and probably you'll have somebody shaking a finger in your face, and probably like a security guard will be there. They might confiscate all your stuff, and then you're kind of screwed, because if you can't prove that you were meant to be here, you might end up going to jail because what you are doing is effectively illegal. So the rules of engagement will also establish how does the other side escalate things. So ideally you tap into existing processes for incident handling, and then the CISO ideally will step in and say, don't investigate this further, it's fine, we'll talk about it later, you guys have detected the thing, that's good for you, go back to work as normal, nothing is actually wrong here. Maybe he won't give away that there's an investigation in progress, but he'll basically reassure the internal team, the SOC team, that yes, they detected something good, this was a test, and they can continue on with their lives and not worry that they're actually being attacked for real by a competitor or something. Then there's the scoping, deciding again what's in scope as far as what can we attack, what type of physical attacks can we do, can we break into the company through a window? Can we walk around the building and maybe try to steal somebody's ID if they dropped it, or follow people in with an RFID scanner, try and copy their ID cards? There's multiple different ways that you can approach this kind of thing, and it really depends on what the company wants to test. Do they want to test their RFID hardware and how that ties in with security gates, and then how that ties into the monitoring system? It really depends on what you want. Ideally, we get like just a white card, do whatever you want, anything goes. We'll sign it off as long as, of course, you haven't killed anybody or done something like that. But anything goes, just test our security and do what you can. And of course, you define an awesome code name, because if you're running a super secret project, you need some kind of cool code name. So give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. So that's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. So yeah, planning and figuring out what you're going to do next is one of the most crucial things in red teaming. The worst thing when doing a red teaming assignment is to be discovered, because once you're discovered, that's it, right? The engagement usually ends. Everybody knows that you're there. You can't go there again. Sometimes you get discovered on the way to the client, which has happened before as well on some of our engagements, where we might have had like 1 or 2 consultants who were supposed to be doing like a sneaking in, and they actually approached the building together, and then they waited a few minutes between each one going in, but on the cameras they were seen together. One of them was picked up maybe by using an invalid ID or some kind of outdated card, and based on the footage they saw that he actually had another colleague, and now both of them are busted and they can no longer participate in the assignment. And then maybe we need to find more people internally, or maybe we need to scrap the whole thing. And that might even be a good conclusion. Maybe we've proven that their ID card monitoring process and the entry gate is securely monitored, and maybe the client is satisfied with this. But usually this is the least satisfying way of actually finishing an assignment. If you were busted within the first day and you expected to be doing this for months, it's a letdown. So for reconnaissance, you're going to start with the internal and external network infrastructure. So this means looking for their publicly registered IP space, looking for whatever domains they have registered, scanning those, trying to get whatever information they have in their DNS records, because maybe they have the names of contacts, maybe they have phone numbers, and you can just start calling people and be like, yeah, I know that you're the admin of this site because I also work for your colleague so-and-so. He told me that I need to get in touch with you because I need access to this machine. I'm not sure who I should contact to get the relevant firewall rules implemented. Can you please help me? And often people will be friendly. You can also fake an email like this, or if you're calling them directly, maybe you just sound legit just because you have the right presence on the phone, or maybe you can pretend to be other things, like a student at a university doing research on something, right? And people will often, if they don't think you're a threat, especially if you're just a student doing a school project or something like that, they might be even more compliant. They might go along with you and just help you out. So you're going to look for IPN ranges and try and identify what's actually there, like VPN connectors and Citrix, right? So you can have like remote desktop. And if you can connect to these things without authentication, then potentially you already have a way into the organization without even having to target a specific user if like the VPN is configured incorrectly. Likewise with Wi-Fi. I had a colleague many years ago in Ireland who did an assessment like this, basically from the parking lot of an organization, which happened to produce pills that were, basically male assistance pills, I guess is the way to put it nicely. But basically from the parking lot, he was able to order 1 million pills and have them delivered to our office. Of course, he notified them when it went through the system, but just by connecting to their Wi-Fi, he was able to connect through various systems because nothing was separated, connect directly to the back end, and he just put in an order himself. And this worked. And so this is an absolutely valid attack attempt. Depending on how an organization's Wi-Fi is set up, this might be possible. There might be plenty of ways to get onto their network that are unexpected. So there's plenty of IP phones as well nowadays, right? You have your phone, it actually just connects over the internet or over the internal network to whatever backend server there is, and it's just voice over IP. The problem being that often that's the exact same network as all the servers and computers. You just unplug the phone, plug your laptop in, and you have full access to the entire network. And that's very easy. You just find a phone, take it out, put your laptop in, and you're done. And of course, the Security Operations Center, if you can get a foot in there, and you know what they see, then of course you can hide yourself better, because if you see what they see, then you can hide. So then of course there's the organization itself, so the physical location and the security of that and their social media presence. So if they're advertising things online, maybe you can use that to your advantage. If they're advertising the barbecue, then maybe you come along as a barbecue company or as like a meat delivery company for that barbecue, and you get away in there because you're like, yes, I'm here with all the chicken you ordered for the whatever, and you get in that way, right? And physical location and security in specific is really important because there are various rules that people follow in general, especially when designing buildings and compounds. That's why you often see little moats or lakes or decorative, ridges outside of a building. The point of these is partly to make it look nice. I mean, it's pretty. It also breaks up the landscape and things like this. But in large part, it's just so that somebody can't drive their car through the front doors because there's a little lake in the way, or there's a huge ridge in the way, or something like that, right? And likewise, the height of a wall and the angle at which the barbed wires stick out at the top. These are all defined in physical security, and there's best practices about how high a wall should be to discourage most people climbing over it. Of course, if somebody really wants to climb over a fence, even if it's 4 meters tall and has a huge hanging over barbed wire thing, they're going to get over it, right? Like even in Fight Club, they just hopped the fence and stole lard, right? So it's quite easy, but basically you're trying to deter as many low-level attackers as possible. So only the highest level attackers will even come, and hopefully you're not that appealing that like a whole country or some large organization is going to target you specifically. Then you're going to look at workstation builds. So if you know that the standard laptop deploys Windows 10 and you know that they have a really bad patch policy and they're probably not updated since last year or something like this, then you know there's a ton of existing vulnerabilities which you can start targeting. Likewise, if all of the servers internally follow the same build and you know that that has built-in vulnerabilities because it's packaging an old OpenSSH or something like that, then maybe you know already that every single server used by this organization is going to have a specific vulnerability, and just by gaining this information you already have a plan and you have certain things that you know you can do to try and escalate privilege or try to exploit the servers. And likewise, virus scanners. I mean, there's vulnerabilities in virus scanners depending on how they're deployed, how they're used, what agents are, is the agent running on the host, what permissions does it have? You can potentially use the virus scanner's agent as a way to exploit the system itself, right? Maybe the update process when it tries to fetch new virus definitions. If that's not implemented securely and you can pretend to be the virus server and give it whatever you want, like if it's a self-update and it just downloads a random executable and runs it to update itself, and you gave it your own executable, well, then you've just used the virus scanner to take over the virus scanner in the system itself. And generally, the virus scanner will also be running at a higher level privilege than a typical user. So you've already gone beyond the typical permissions for that user. You've escalated your privileges on that host. And finally, there's employees. So like the names and details and their security awareness level. If you have employees working for an organization, one of the first things you would do is look at them on LinkedIn or on Facebook. If on LinkedIn you see that 90% of the developers working for an organization are focusing currently on like this specific thing in Java and they need experience in this framework, etc., just based on the keywords on their LinkedIn profile, now you already know what you should target. So don't send somebody who's an expert in C to go attack a client who mostly develops in Java potentially, right? Send somebody who has knowledge appropriate for it, and of course the company itself is going to advertise the knowledge they need, and based on that you know what you need to target. So there's passive and active information gathering. So of course, active information gathering is directly scanning systems. There's tools that do that, like Spiderfoot, which can just basically scan a bunch of places, look for information, correlate information. There's other tools that combine open information, like from DNS queries, from Google queries, and things like this. There's also search engines like Shodan that just regularly index whatever's connected to the internet. And if you can find something like a vulnerable webcam that's connected on a public IP belonging to a certain organization, potentially this is the way to attack the company. And this is something that happens quite a lot as well. Years ago in Canada, I was working for a bank, and it turned out that actually in the conference rooms, in one of the conference rooms that all the board members would use for all the super secret meetings, there was a webcam there, and it was completely open. Anybody on the internal network who wasn't even authenticated could just look at that webcam and listen into the conversations going on in the secret boardroom. So when this was discovered, of course, the executives were pretty upset. It was quickly patched. But still, this was a pretty big organization that had a fairly developed security process, and still, this happens. Probably with printers is the same thing. I don't know how many printers you guys have, but they often have a lot of functionality that potentially can be abused. If you scan a document in a multifunction printer, and then it mails it to you, usually it'll mail it to you as you, right? Because that printer will be configured to have permission to send mail belonging to or as anybody else, not on behalf of them, so that when you reply it goes to the correct person, but in the headers you still see that it came from printer 549 on floor 3, but actually it'll come from that user directly. So now if you can compromise the printer, potentially you can just send arbitrary emails to the CEO from the CFO, or to the CFO from the CEO saying, hey, look, we have this deal that we need to do immediately in America. We have the next 5 hours to raise $10 million. I need to transfer to this bank account, otherwise it's going to fall through and all our shareholders are going to be upset. Do it. And probably the CFO will. Maybe they have correct processes in place to catch this kind of thing, but this does happen. And if all we have to go on is the header in an email, then potentially you won't even see who it came from. If you're using Outlook or something, it might just automatically insert a picture or something like this, and right away to you it looks legit. It's coming from the CEO. It looks like everything's fine, and then you just act on it. So then next is the exploitation step. So the idea with exploitation is there's various social engineering incentives. So you want financial gain, maybe for ideology, or because you want to manipulate the country, the company, or their reputation. So there's different reasons to do exploitation. And then also, as part of exploiting the client, or however to get a foothold, you're going to use fear and urgency. So often you'll see phishing emails, spear phishing even, so targeted to a specific executive with their name, with some kind of information that they assume only privileged people know, like, by the way, that meeting last week we had about this acquisition, we think it'll go forward, but we need the following money in this account tomorrow, right? So by having some kind of fear and urgency in it and having some kind of internal information, you can facilitate exploiting people. And so for social engineering, that comes down to phishing and spear phishing, which is just sending emails either in mass to the entire company or to specific people to make it look like it's actually coming from somebody trusted and close to that person. There's vishing, which is like voice phishing basically, or potentially video phishing. There's pretexting, baiting, tailgating, quid pro quo. So if you know somebody working for an organization and you've done them a favor, maybe they'll do you a favor. Yeah, I forgot my ID today. Can you maybe let me into the building anyway, right? So the thing is, you have to find the weakest link, and that's the challenge. And that's also the challenge with non-red teaming engagements. So in a typical pen testing assignment, like a web app testing assignment, you have a scope and you have a time limit, 5 days. Find as much as you can in 5 days, but that's not enough time to find everything. And ultimately, that's our goal as a tester. We have to find absolutely everything that could possibly go wrong so that you can protect your application. On the other side, for the red team, for the bad guys, they only need to find one bug, right? One bug to get in, and then the next bug to get further, and the next bug to get further, until they finally get to the crown jewels. And there's a lot of creating and deploying attacks. So which attacks have the highest likelihood of success and the lowest risk of detection. So this goes back to planning again, because you need to make sure that you have a solid plan and that you're not risking getting caught for just some low-level attack. So for something random like, well, I want to know who maintains this server, if you get busted just trying to find out who's responsible for maintaining a server, that's terrible. So you really want to prioritize the most high-value things and also make them the lowest risk things. So now for this, if this works, I have a quick video. Okay, so can I full screen it? So basically, this is using Metasploit Console. So on the one side, we've created an Excel file which contains a payload. And at the bottom, we're running a simple HTTP server that's going to host another payload. So Metasploit can generate executables and other kinds of payloads that you can then use to run commands on the host. And in this case, we've emailed that Excel file to a user, potentially in your organization, just we emailed them. They open the Excel file because maybe it says that it's the newest numbers or some kind of resume or something. Of course, it pops up with warnings saying, hey, don't just run this, but most people ignore these things. They run it. And as they scroll around, whatever that component is will actually execute. And then on the left side at the bottom, you see that suddenly there's incoming requests. And that payload exe has been downloaded. So by using a compromised Excel file or PDF file or something and targeting a specific person, we've now gotten them to execute something and download a file from us. In Metasploit, we can see that when this file was downloaded and run, they connected to us. And now, actually, in this top window, you can see we have a reverse shell. So we now have command level access. We have a shell, a command prompt or whatever. Oof. One sec, that kind of ended brutally. So we have now a shell on that server, and we're able to run whatever we want on their behalf. And in this case, they're running getuid, and you can see that the current username is AWM/FBlack, so Frank Black perhaps. So we now have an within their organization, somewhere ideally sensitive, maybe this is developer on a developer network or something like that. And just with this, with them running our executable, running the Excel file, we now have some kind of entry into their organization through which we can try exploiting further. Now, it could have been done through phishing. It could have been done through we stole a laptop, and a month ago or so there was news that BitLocker, the way some implementations of BitLocker, or rather full disk encryption, some of those implementations were bad, where they would always use the same password in the hardware to encrypt the disk, But then when you set your own password, that would actually just be a fake password where it would let you use the real password to unlock the disk. So if you could bypass the fake password check and just put in the real password that was actually used, you would unlock the disk, right? So this was just a bug in the actual hardware implementation from different providers of how full disk encryption worked. And when people used like BitLocker or something that expected this to actually work according to spec, and it didn't, you wouldn't know until somebody stole your laptop, popped the drive out, and now potentially they've retrieved all the data from there. They can pull whatever credentials are stored on there. Maybe even if the laptop was still running, they can scrape memory and things like this. Really depends on what you can do, but ultimately getting an entry into an organization isn't that hard. You could even drop USB keys, right? Or hand out free gifts. I mean, sadly, I don't have any USB keys, but if I had USB gifts to hand out to you guys, I wouldn't trust them at all. I would wipe them as soon as I got them and make sure that I don't put them on any internet connected systems, because obviously I'm a hacker and who knows what I'm going to do. So once things have been exploited, we have a spot in the network. And so now we enter the post-exploitation phase. So we're inside the network somewhere, and now we want to do something. So first of all, we want to elevate our access and make sure that it persists, right? So that as soon as Mr. Frank Black goes home, our connection doesn't die, right? So we want to spread as much as we can so that there's always something phoning home, so that we always have some connection into their network. And of course, we don't want to spread too much, because then it becomes obvious when suddenly 50 different computers within an organization are connecting to some random IP address nobody has ever seen before. That might mean something, and then people will get suspicious. So you need to balance being noisy with, of course, maintaining enough noise to keep that connection alive. And then you move towards whatever goal you have. So trying to escalate your privileges to either gain control of the host itself, gain control of the network, jump between hosts if there's network segregation in place, and basically, lateral movement throughout the organization, trying to discover where are the secrets, how are things protected, how does the network look. And so here I have an example of, this is the second video. So once we have this connection, we run a command in Metasploit called getSystem, and what this basically does is it tries to escalate to the system privilege, right, to the system user. Unfortunately, in this case, it didn't work, but there's different modules in Metasploit that exist. In this case, we're running the post-exploitation phase Windows gather credentials from the group policy. And as you can see, what popped up is there's this username, client admin, and we have their password, because these credentials were stored on the system, and they can be cracked if you have sufficient access. And so now what we can do is we can run commands as this administrator. First we did net user, which is just a normal Windows command to see what are the permissions available to the user. And we can see that this guy is an administrator. And so now, of course, we can kill our previous session as Frank Black. We still have a shell connected. And we can basically escalate. We run a new command as this admin. And then based on that, we now have, as that admin, we can run our initial payload, the file that we uploaded, and then as the admin, it'll connect back to us and we have a new shell. So we had an existing shell as the Frank Black user, and now we're establishing a new shell running as the client admin on this specific host. Now this is still limited, you're just the administrator on the host. Often in an organization, users will have local admin privilege anyway, but not necessarily. But in this case, we're running the downloaded payload.exe that we previously have in Frank Black's local temp folder. And we're running it as the user client admin. We can specify the password, of course, client admin 123 exclamation mark. And then you run it. Well, you attach it to a session within Metasploit. So Metasploit is nice because it lets you manage multiple sessions and various tools to do data gathering, to do exploitation and things like this. So we're configuring it, we're running it, and then what we end up seeing is we have a process started, and then we just wait a little while, and eventually we should see some kind of connection attempt, because this payload is what phones home. This is what's trying to connect back to our server to maintain persistence, to retrieve commands from our host. So as soon as that kicks in, it sometimes takes a while, of course, depending on the client, but suddenly in Metasploit you can see that, hey, there's a connection coming in. And then we can open that session, which in this case is session 2, and then we have a shell. And we run getUID, and then we can see now we are as the user client admin. So now we have local admin on some random host. So we started from a developer, and now we have local admin on the host. Well, what can we do from there? Well, the next step is, of course, to gather more information. What administrators exist within this environment? Are they using like a domain admin setup? Like, do they have an actual Active Directory setup with proper domain admins that have access to absolutely everything? How is this configured? And so we run different components. In this case, this is a privilege migrate command. And so we're trying to become system again. We've managed to escalate from client admin to system because the administrator has permission to run certain tools, and those tools might have bugs or other ways of becoming the system user. And the system user basically has all permission on the host because that's Windows. So now we are running as the system user, and we can load a plugin, which is Kiwi in this case. It's Mimikatz. And Mimikatz is a tool that you can use to crack stored hashes on the server. So any users who have previously connected to the server have some kind of credentials stored still on the server, and these are encrypted, but we can crack that. And in this case we did, and so now we have this AWM admin user, and we have their password, and we know what domain they're on. And so we can make a shell, and we can run net user with the name of this new admin just to see what permissions they have within the organization. And when we do that for the domain, we see that actually this is a domain user, an enterprise admin, and a domain admin. So this user account that we've discovered, who happened to be logged in on the system at some point, maybe it was a shared server, maybe it was directly this laptop, this person was there, we have their credentials, and they have full access to the entire internal network. And we have their password. So now we can just do whatever we want. We can log in to your servers. If you have an internal certificate authority or like a proxy server or something, which probably you have an internal certificate authority, we can attack that, generate our own certificates. In one assignment, one of our consultants, the client actually had quite a good separation between networks. However, the certificate authority was accessible from wherever we compromised the network. And based on that, we were able to generate new certificates. And we were able to use those certificates with a man-in-the-middle attack when people were trying to connect to the password vault. And so now we're in between users who are connecting to the password vault, which has all the passwords for the organization. We can see all that traffic, we steal their passwords, and now we have all of the passwords for the organization as well, right? So depending on what access is available, you can really go quite far. So then basically, once we have that lateral movement, now the point is exfiltrate data. So what can we send externally? How can we leak data? Or maybe we want to try specific flags to see, can they notice us? Will the client notice us because maybe we're testing their incident response team? Maybe we're actually trying to steal some information just to prove that we can. Here's all the data we got from you. Here's all your tables and things like this. So we need to do that in a sensitive way, right? Because if suddenly you start trying to upload gigs of data to some random server from somewhere that's never connected to the internet before, that's probably going to trigger some kind of flags. So you really need to decide how to package the information, how to send it out in a way that maybe looks benign so people don't pick up on it initially, maybe break it up into chunks, random sized chunks, things like this. Try to fool all the tools that exist to catch this sort of thing. And then afterwards, of course, there's a step of purple teaming, where the red team and the blue team come together to discuss the whole process. Who saw what flags were triggered, what things did they notice? Sometimes the blue team will come back and say, yeah, we saw you attacking this server on this day doing this, and we'll be like, yeah, that wasn't us, right? And so clearly somebody else was doing something, and they did notice that at least, and maybe it's actually even worse now because they didn't act on it because they thought it was us. Maybe the CISO or whoever said, yeah, don't follow up on it because this is approved, but actually in this case it wasn't. And this is where communication is really important, because then the CISO or whoever the white team is needs to have a way of communicating with the red team to verify that the attack actually came from the red team. Because the worst thing would be if the red teaming activities are used as a mask for real hackers who are actually trying to hack the organization and steal stuff. Then, of course, there's evaluations, what went right, what went wrong, how did the process work, and then there's a whole report generated about what improvements can be made or what lessons were learned. So that was that last demo, actually. And basically, this is a typical kind of split network. So there's often a DMZ with web servers at the front. Of course, there's an internal network with workstations, developer boxes. Maybe there's a separate network for test environment and something like this. Depending on how these are all interconnected, if they're not securely separated, and you can find one host that has access to another host on a different segment, then you can just slip through the network. Ideally, you map it out like this. You create a diagram as the red team. You create a diagram of what you see so that you understand the possible avenues of attack, the vectors that you can use. But then the more information you have, the better picture you have of the actual target organization and the potential attacks that you can use to target that organization. So yeah, ultimately, emails, organizational structure are very important, so don't publish too much information online. Like LinkedIn is a really good resource for intelligence of just figuring out how an organization works. Who should I target? If I'm pretending to be the CEO and I want to talk to the CISO to do something specific, or maybe I'm using their names to talk to the administrator of a server, all of this information is usually available on LinkedIn. So as an organization, you should also be careful about what your people can actually post on there, right? So there are actually some companies that just refuse to allow you to put on LinkedIn or Facebook that you work there, right? There's quite a few hackers, even in the Netherlands, where they work at confidential as confidential. That's on their LinkedIn profile. And fair enough, that's actually ultimately secure, especially for a security consultant. There's also technical infrastructure, so like no sender policy framework records. So if they have different components like mail that aren't properly secured, we can target those, and just by looking at what they have available publicly as information, we can get a lot of ideas and potential vectors by which we can compromise the target organization. So in this case, the attack plan was created. So we were going to target the financial manager Frank via spear phishing, which was that Excel file that was sent over. The first goal was CEO fraud. So if we are this financial manager Frank, and we can fake emails to the CEO, then we can do exactly what I said before, where it's urgent, we need $10 million, send it here, and then we can make an acquisition. Second goal is, of course, persistent access to the internal network, and in this case, it was through the DDE Office exploit, by which the Office can run random executables. It's actually pretty simple. You can create an Excel file, and if in one of the cells you put something like run/calc.exe, as soon as you open the Excel file, if you have macros enabled, it'll just open calculator on your screen, which is a nice way of proving a point. It's not that exciting, but if you have your own way of dropping executables there, then you can use that for whatever. And everybody uses Excel nowadays, especially in big organizations, and for the most part, they do need macros and things, so they have a lot of things enabled. And on top of that, we have a culture that we've established where a lot of people just automatically click accept, right? There's certificate warnings on most websites you access, especially in a big organization. It'll say this is insecure or whatever, this is self-signed, and you'll just accept it because you're used to it. Anytime you get a pop-up that says, hey, you need your credentials to access this resource, you just reflexes to type it in. And in this way, we've conditioned people to basically just go along with these things and ignore security warnings. So such an example would be here, an email. Frank, I made a deal with a company for certain services to improve our current online market position. Their details are included in the attachment. Please deposit 21K to their account and complete the form included before I leave the conference. This happens a lot. One of the clients I've worked with actually had something similar happen, and they were about to approve a multi-million-dollar transaction when one of the controls actually kicked in, and somebody said, wait a second, they needed additional approval from somebody, follow up on it, and then it was noticed that actually this didn't come from anybody in the company, and it was a scam, right? So at the last minute, just before somebody actually approved it, it was caught. And that's a bit too close for comfort, especially for most organizations, and smaller ones that might not be able to afford losing all of their money quickly. So then there's an attack plan after the exploitation. So in this case, we escalated privileges to domain admin. So we became a local administrator, then we gathered the domain admin credentials and then escalated across the network that way. And ultimately, this makes an effective red teamer. Basically having a good big picture of here's all the things we need to understand, here's what we need to look for. Based on each of the components, based off each piece of information that we obtain, we now have next steps. We have a plan on where to go from there, what we can do to exploit this component, how this component fits into the big picture of the organization's security posture and stuff like that. And based on that now, we have a good idea of what we want to do, we have a plan, and that makes an effective red team exercise. And that's it. So this one was a bit quicker. Any questions?
Applause.
Oh yeah, yes, please applaud.
Thank you for a great talk again.
Thank you.
Questions, anyone?
Yep.
Here's one question.
This company, was this an exception, or is this actually quite regular that you can do this?
That's difficult to answer because there is, of course, no need legal for people to publish this information. So it's hard to say how many companies actually fall victim to such a thing, especially since none would advertise that they did. So
Unknown.
Yes, exactly. So unfortunately, I can't really say how common this is, and we don't do enough red teaming for me to give any kind of statistics, meaningful statistics about the Netherlands in general or the world in general. But yeah, I mean, this kind of mail fraud happens all the time, whether it's ransomware or actual EXEs or things like this to obtain persistence, and specifically spoofing mails and things like this. That happens pretty regularly as well, and it's not that difficult. I mean, ultimately, the mail server is a command processor. You send it commands and data, and if you can fool it, then you'll end up just displaying whatever you want on the client system. So it might not even be that it's a technical attack. It could just be a social engineering, like fooling the user. Potentially you have a website like we're secura.com, but maybe somebody registers securo.com and we don't notice that it's an A instead of an O. Likewise, there's different encoding schemes, like different character sets where you have like the Unicode attacks, where using Unicode, you can write U in multiple different ways. It looks like you, but it's actually a different character. So you can register a different domain that looks like Secura if you just look at it. If you have a technical measure somewhere that actually says, is this actually Secura in bytes, you know, like the actual data, then that'll validate it. But if it's just a user looking at it, then potentially they can be fooled.
Any other questions? Yes.
Until now, I've got the impression that this was mainly targeting bigger corporations. How would something like red teaming scale to like something with 10 employees, for example, running maybe a relatively large infrastructure?
Yeah, so I mean, there are obvious differences, like social engineering and trying to pretend you're somebody's colleague is much more difficult when everybody is on a first name basis with each other. So that would limit those kinds of attacks, but then there's still plenty of options to drop USB keys or to compromise other exposed infrastructure and escalate that way, right? And there have been instances where we were at smaller organizations maybe, and actually one person had escalated privilege to a certain admin and was running commands on another server, and another administrator saw that happening and actually sent a message that popped up on the hacker's PC saying, hey, whatever, Joel, what are you doing? I didn't think you'd be working at this hour, right? And so it becomes harder in some ways, but potentially in some ways it becomes easier because the smaller a company is, the less strict it's going to be about what information it shares. So it'll be pretty easy for me to discover which are your colleagues, and potentially I can even find out what exactly each of you is working on, because it's a small group with clearly defined responsibilities, and so it's much easier for me to figure out who's the administrator of this specific server than it would be in a big organization which might just have like a generic contact address for that.
I have a quick follow-up question. To start training teams with things like capture the flag, those types of exercises, usually there's a party that knows the answer, basically. Do you have any recommendations for things where nobody knows the answer, basically, and still do capture the flag?
So basically like really custom built capture the flag exercises with no answer sheet available. Something like that. Unfortunately, no, and I think the problem with that is while there exist custom ones, they're usually custom developed for specific people, for specific organizations. The problem being that as soon as you publish something like this online, there will probably be an answer sheet. It's the same problem that we as an organization have when we're trying to recruit talent. If we because we have a hack test as part of applying for us, you need to hack a certain application. If we expose that on the internet, then it's probably going to get hacked, and the answer sheet will be available within a week or two, maybe a bit longer because we're not that well known outside of the Netherlands, but still the answer sheet would be pretty quickly available. So yes, I'm sure there are plenty of CTF exercises where the answers aren't quite as obvious, but then they're really new, and probably in a few months the answers will be there.
Any more questions? Well, in that case, one more time, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.